The Vikings believed your death was already written, not by you, not by your gods, by 3 silent women sitting beneath a tree at the center of the world, weaving the thread of every life that ever was. And when your thread was cut, that was it. No prayer, no sword, no act of courage could buy you a single day more. These were the people who sailed straight into storms that swallowed whole fleets, who walked into battles outnumbered 10 to 1 and laughed about it. And the reason they could do something that insane comes down to one belief that we've almost completely forgotten. They were convinced that nothing they did could change the day they died, so they stopped being afraid of it. But the same belief that made them fearless on the battlefield made the rest of the world a deeply unsettling place to live. Because if your fate is already decided, then somewhere out there, something already knows it. And the Vikings spent their whole lives feeling watched. To understand why, you have to understand where they lived. Not the warm, golden halls of the movies. Picture a thin strip of farmland pinned between black mountains and a colder, hungrier sea. The growing season was brutally short. One bad harvest, one long winter, one storm at the wrong moment, and an entire family could be wiped out before spring. Survival here wasn't about strength, it was about luck. And when your whole life hangs on luck, you start to wonder who exactly is handing it out. So they built a world thick with invisible neighbors. Every farm, every field, every pile of stones had something living in it that you could not see. And the most important of them all lived right under your feet. They called it the land spirit. It was the unseen owner of the ground your house sat on, and keeping it happy was the difference between a good harvest and a ruined one. You left it offerings, food, a bowl of milk, a share of the first cut of grain. You spoke softly near its places, and above all, you never ever insulted the land you lived on. There were laws, real laws, that ordered sailors to take the snarling dragon heads off their ships before they came home into harbor. Not to scare their enemies, to avoid frightening the spirits of their own land, because here was the rule that governed everything. You were never alone, and you were never the most powerful thing in the room, even in your own home. And that brings us to the creatures who shared your house, not enemies. Not exactly. Something far stranger. They believed a small being lived in the barn or under the floor, a sort of guardian of the household. If you treated it well, your cows gave more milk, your luck held, and your family prospered. But it was proud, easily offended, and it never forgot a slight. Spill its food, mock it, or forget its offering at the feast, and it could turn on you overnight. Animals would sicken, milk would sour, tools would break in your hands. The thing that kept your home alive could, in a single night, decide to tear it apart. So even in the safest place a Viking knew, surrounded by family, behind a bolted door, there was always something to keep happy. Always a presence to respect. The Viking home was never fully yours, and if the indoors was crowded, the wild was far worse. Out beyond the last fence, past the edge of the farmland, the rules changed completely. That was the territory of the hidden folk. They looked almost human. Tall, beautiful, living inside hills and rocks and cliffs. But they belonged to the wild, and the wild doesn't love you. They could heal a dying child or strike a strong man mad. They could lead a traveler home through a blizzard or lure him off a cliff in the dark for the sheer amusement of it. The danger wasn't that they were evil. It was that they simply didn't think the way people think. You could not predict them. You could not bargain with them and trust the deal. You could only stay on the right side of the path and hope they were in a generous mood. And every Viking knew the stories. The shepherd who vanished on the mountain and came back a year later, unable to speak, his hair gone white. The woman who followed beautiful music into a hillside and was never seen again. These weren't fairy tales told to children. They were warnings, sworn to as fact by people who claimed to have seen it with their own eyes. But the most terrifying watcher of all wasn't in your barn or out on the mountain. It was in the sky. The Vikings believed that when the fighting started, the dead were already being chosen, and not by the men swinging the swords. High above every battlefield rode armored women on horseback, picking out exactly who would live and who would fall before a single blow had landed. They were the choosers of the slain, and they were not gentle guardian angels. They were grim, beautiful, and merciless, gathering the bravest of the dead to carry them off to the Hall of the Fallen, where they would feast and fight until the end of the world. So imagine standing in a shield wall, the enemy roaring toward you, and believing, truly believing, that the women who decide your death are already circling overhead and have already made up their minds. That belief did something extraordinary to a person. If you were going to die when it was your time and not a moment sooner, then flinching was pointless. Cowardice didn't save you. It only robbed you of the one thing fate couldn't touch, how you faced the end. And how you faced it mattered more than anything, because of what the Vikings thought happened next. We imagine they all dreamed of one glorious afterlife. The truth is far stranger and far darker. The Hall of the Slain was only for a chosen few. For most people, death led somewhere cold, gray, and quiet. A dim world beneath the earth, ruled by a goddess who was half living woman and half rotting corpse. It wasn't a punishment. It wasn't fire and torment. It was something almost worse to them. It was ordinary. A long, gray forever, far from the feasting and the glory, where the great deeds of the world above were nothing more than a rumor. That's the fear that drove them, not death itself. Being forgotten. Slipping into the gray and leaving nothing behind. And there was only one cure for it. They believed a man could become immortal. Not his body, his name. Do something great enough, brave enough, terrible enough, and people would speak of you long after your thread was cut. Your reputation would outlive your bones. It would be carved into stones and sung in the halls for generations. To a Viking, that was the only true afterlife that mattered. As one of their poems put it, cattle die, kinsmen die, you yourself will die. But one thing never dies, the reputation of a dead man. Suddenly, the raids make a kind of terrible sense. The danger wasn't a deterrent. It was the entire point. A safe life was a forgotten life, a gray life. The men who sailed into storms and walked into impossible battles weren't reckless. They were chasing the only immortality they believed a person could earn. And so they marked the world with their names. Carved into towering stones that still stand today, raised by grieving families, are short, fierce messages from people who refused to be forgotten. A mother for her son. A brother for a brother lost overseas. Some of them simply list a name and a single brave deed, frozen in stone for 1,000 years. They worked. We are still reading them right now. The Vikings beat the gray afterlife by reaching across 1,000 years to make sure we would say their names out loud. But there's one last piece to all of this, and it's the strangest of all. Because for all their talk of fate being fixed, the Vikings believed you could glimpse it, bend close to it, even ask it questions. There were people, mostly women, believed to walk the line between the seen and unseen world. They would go into a trance, sometimes high on a special platform above the crowd, and journey out of their bodies to where the answers lived. Whole communities would gather around them in the dark, singing the songs that opened the door, desperate to know what was coming. Would the winter be kind? Would the sick child live? Would the men come home from the sea? And people listened. Kings listened. Because in a world where fate was already written, the most powerful person alive wasn't the one with the biggest army. It was the one who could read a page of the future before the rest of you got there. So take away the long ships. Take away the axes and the dragon heads and the burning monasteries. What you're left with is something deeply, achingly human. A people living on the edge of survival, certain they were never alone, certain their deaths were already decided and determined, against all of it, to be remembered. They didn't conquer half the world because they weren't afraid. They conquered it because they were terrified of one thing above all others: being forgotten. And 1,000 years later, here we are, still talking about them. They got exactly what they wanted.